Hello and welcome to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at the Women's University Club in Seattle is conservation biologist Thor Hanson. Thor, thank you for making the trip down from the island that you live on into the big city.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, Nancy.
Your new book is called, and I love the cover and I love the title and the subtitle. I'm a big subtitle fan.
Well, it's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, so I'm going to read it out loud. The Triumph of Seeds, How Grains, Nuts, Kernels, Pulses, and Pips Conquered the Plant Kingdom and Shaped Human History. Was that your, did that subtitle just come tripping into your mind?
Yeah, it just rolls off the tongue.
Right.
Just rolls off the tongue. It was a challenge, but I wanted to come up with something that included the range of seeds that are out there and reminded us all not only that they are successful out in nature, that you look out your window and see a world dominated by seed plants, but that they just may have conquered us as well, in that we are so reliant upon them for everything from the cotton in our clothes to the coffee in our cups. So it's an attempt to encapsulate the book in a few words.
Will you explain, I think everybody probably knows grain, nut, kernel, pips, but what are pulses?
The pulses, a marvelous group of seed plants. The beans, the legumes, are called the pulses. So, in part two, there's an attempt to use some of these really descriptive and marvelous words for seeds that have fallen out of use. One of the ones that I'm so regretful, it's all the Post Company stole the term cereal. But cereal used to refer to the annual grasses that we eat, the wheat and the barley and the oats. Those were the cereals, very distinct from the grains, which is sort of a catch-all term. But once they started making breakfast cereal, everyone forgot about that lovely word cereal and what it really referred to. The Romans had a god, Ceres, who was the goddess of the harvest and the goddess of those annual grasses. So anyway, an attempt here and there to bring some of these wonderful words back.
Well, I have to say, Thor, you grew up on San Juan Island, or on Orcas and in Bellingham, not San Juan Island. But I grew up in Detroit, and
same.
And seeds. I mean, of course, I tried to. I grew, put an avocado pit in water and all of that, and we had grass in between on the sidewalks and things like that, which you actually talk about how grass is like this hardy plant. I mean, it just insists on coming up. But I never thought about seeds. I mean, I never thought.
Yeah, well, that's part of why I chose seeds as a topic, in that, in today's world, we live at a distance from nature. I mean, even those of us who live in rural areas live a lifestyle that's quite removed from much of the rural tradition. We keep chickens in our household, but I will freely admit to you that when the first batch of hens started getting on in years, we dreaded the idea of putting them in the stew pot. So it was actually sort of a relief when a fox got the lot of them. We didn't have to worry about it. But, and many of us are living now in cities. In fact, for the first time, more than half the human population is living in cities. So we're really becoming an urban species in many ways. So one of the appeals about writing about seeds was that these are natural objects that transcend the boundary we erect between nature and the human world. We interact with these things every day and hardly ever stop to think about them. But when we do pause and take that time to investigate, we find that these little marvels have incredible stories and incredible lessons to teach us about evolution and biology, nature and our connections to it.
You talk in the book about how you came up, how something that, an anecdote about your son sort of fed into the book itself. Will you share that?
Yeah, so that age-old writer's question of where do you get your ideas?
Right.
Well, I was casting about for a new book idea, and generally for me it's choosing among the many ideas because I'm just fascinated by so many things in nature. So seeds were on my short list, and I had studied seeds as part of my doctoral research. But what might have tipped the balance was the pronunciation and fascination of my young son, who at the time was 2, 3 years old and had an absolute fascination with seeds. He was constantly taking apart pieces of fruit and looking at seeds and figuring out which things had seeds and which didn't was really one of the first ways he learned to order his world. A pine cone, seeds. Tomato, seeds. Avocado, sesame bagel, seeds. Raccoon, no seeds. So these conversations were just a part of our daily routine. But what really, was the clincher was how he pronounced things at that age.
He had a problem with S's.
He had a problem with S's, like many kids. But instead of just developing a lisp, which might have been the easy thing to do, he just decided he would do away with S, and he would replace that sound with something he could say, which was a hard H. And so that meant that whenever we were having these discussions and he was taking apart an apple or something and pulling these things out, he'd hold them up to me and shout, "Heed! Heed, Papa," over and over again until I finally got the message and heeded the seeds and knew that had to be the next book topic.
So when you decided to do this, and building on what you had done as a graduate student with the seeds study, what was the first step for you in researching the book, and what were you trying to find out?
Yeah, well, I come to these topics, with a background in science, and so that's probably the strength when I'm beginning, is I have, some research experience and that sort of thing. And what is always the great part of the adventure for me is learning about the cultural history of seeds or of feathers, which I wrote about previously. These incredible cultural stories. And if you start to trace them back and find the connections to the biology, you quickly realize that the very same things that make seeds, for example, so successful in nature, these characteristics that they have, that they have nutrition inside for the baby plant and that they're built to disperse and travel in all these fantastic ways. All of these characteristics that make them successful are the very same things that make us so dependent upon them. Seeds evolved from spores. Well, spores don't have any nutrition for a baby plant, and so we don't eat spores. It makes perfect sense. And seeds evolved to disperse away from the parent plant. Well, how are you going to do that? You're going to have a bunch of fibers that drift in the wind. Well, that gives us cotton. Or you're going to be encased inside some delicious piece of fruit. Well, that gives us apples and cucumbers and all of the other fleshy fruits that we rely upon for parts of our diet. So there are these great connections between the cultural stories and the biological stories, and it's just a wonderful adventure to research.
One of the ones that I was fascinated with was about dates in Masada, and that could you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a marvelous story. One of those key characteristics of seeds that makes them so successful is that they go dormant. And we know this sort of intuitively in that you buy a packet of seeds down at the hardware store and you can leave them on your shelf and forget about them for a year or two, and then, still get around to planting the zinnias or whatever it was you had planned. And they're still good. And so seeds go dormant and they can last for months or years, in the soil or on your shelf or wherever. So one of the questions then becomes, how long could a seed possibly last? And the current record holder is a marvelous story. It is the pit of a date that was excavated in an archaeological dig at a place called Masada, which is on the edge of the Dead Sea. It's an old fortress that's a very important cultural site in Israel because it was the site of this famous resistance, these rebels that were occupying the fortress and were eventually overrun by the Romans. So it's a very important site. And they did a great dig there in the 60s and just took it apart stone by stone, and they found this old storehouse that had, you know, olive oil and grains and all the food things that were left, including a huge bunch of these Judean dates, which was a famous date at the time that has since disappeared. No one grew this date anymore. Well, here they are, the Judean dates. And so, by gosh, they were so beautifully preserved, there were still bits of date flesh clinging to the seeds. And these were, you know, they're good archaeologists, so they put numbers on these things and stuck them in a drawer. And then some botanists got a hold of them a few years ago and planted some. And by gosh, one of them sprouted after over 2,000 years, buried in the rubble at Masada. So it's a wonderful story of just how long, when the conditions are right, a seed can live.
Why would a seed remain dormant underground? I mean, not like the storage bins at, you know, just bins, not like the storage things at Masada, but you said that it could remain dormant.
Yeah.
Is it because it's an inhospitable environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the evolutionary drive for dormancy is to really give the plants a way to disperse their babies in a different way. We're used to the idea of dispersing through space, inside a piece of fruit or a burr that sticks into your sock, and off you go and disperse the seed through space. But dormancy allows a plant to disperse its babies through time. Yeah, in that not all moments in time are created equal in terms of a good time to grow as a plant. If you sprout right before winter and you are immediately killed in a freeze, that's a dreadful time to have gotten a start. So the plants have developed over evolutionary time this ability to go dormant in the seed stage, which allows them then to remain in the soil until conditions are right, until it is a springtime with warmth and rain, for example, or in a desert ecosystem where you have not just a brief shower, but a sustained rain that you can actually grow in as a plant. In some systems, the dormancy strategy has to do with fire. So there are seeds out there that will not germinate until they've been exposed to wood smoke. And then that triggers something inside the seed that says, okay, there's a new space opened up here by the flames, and there is a flush of nutrients from all this ash, and now it's time to grow and start life. So it's really a fascinating biological phenomenon, dormancy, poorly understood in many ways, just how they do it, and all of these great strategies for knowing somehow when it is the right time to start to grow.
In some ways, it's almost as though you're talking about the seeds having consciousness.
Yes, and this gets me in trouble with a lot of my scientist friends.
Right. All the anthropomorphism.
Yeah, but in terms of storytelling, it's an important way to explain evolutionary principles. It's not a conscious thing, but over great periods of time, you can almost imagine a will or a consciousness, in the great iteration of evolution and the trial and error leads towards these elegant solutions. Mm-hmm. And it's a powerful way to explain it.
How is it explained? I mean, I get the story. Those are wonderful. I love those stories in here. But, I mean, how do you think the seed knows that it's time to do that?
Well,
is that a silly question? You remember, I'm from Detroit. I know nothing.
No, it's not a silly question. And in fact, it's a question that people have spent careers trying to unravel. Wonderful botanists who I interviewed for the book, Carol and Jerry Baskin, specifically study how seeds come out of dormancy. What are all of these strategies for going dormant, for knowing when to come out of it. But it remains somewhat mysterious just how they respond to things. Certainly seeds are very responsive to the environment around them. They can respond to changes in moisture, changes in the quality of the light, whether it's filtering through snow to get to the soil or whether it's filtering through leaves. All of those subtle changes seeds respond to. So there are a whole suite of things, temperature, moisture, soil conditions, smoke and fire, that can trigger the time to germinate.
Okay, switching to a seed that I do know a little bit about, the avocado pit.
Yes.
Now, why is the avocado pit so darn big?
Oh, what a great question. So the size of this avocado pit, it's absurd. I mean, you may remember that movie, Oh God, where George Burns played the God character, and he said, you know, he didn't make too many mistakes, but the pit's too big in the avocado. I mean, and you know, and many people would agree, except for botanists, because the avocado pit is such a great seed for classroom studies, because everything's there in large format. So the avocado evolved in a rainforest setting in Central America, and its ancestor was built to survive in that seed form and as a sapling for a long time in a very shady situation. So the strategy then from the parent plant's point of view over evolutionary time was to pack that seed with a lot of nutrition so that the baby plant could then feed off the energy in the seed for all of those months and years even in the semi-darkness until hopefully a tree nearby would fall or there would be other disturbances that open up light and a place for that tree to really take off and grow. So what's really fascinating to do, if you do that sprouting experiment with the toothpicks and the water, is to then plant that once it sprouts in, and you can keep them as houseplants. Avocados live for a long time. And I've got one now that's over 4 years old, and there's still nutrition in the seed. You can still see the seed clinging to the base of that plant, and the plant continues to use nutrition that the parent plant stored in the seed years ago.
That reminds me of something that you said that actually made me feel better. You said it early in the book, and you said that though you're a botanist, that you don't have good luck with houseplants. and I say that because I probably am the only person who has not one houseplant because I'm just not, I don't do well with them, or they don't do well with me or something.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by plants, but I've never had a gift for, someone told me once, well, this is a spider plant, or you can't possibly kill this. Plants and we have a great understanding that, I will study them and appreciate them, but I should not be in charge of watering them.
Yeah. When you go out into the field to do the research, it is random, right? Which little bit you study, right? You throw that.
Oh yeah, depending on the study.
Yes.
If you're trying to come up with an idea of a plant community, you do want it to be a random sample,
right.
And so there are various ways to randomize things.
And what is that called? The thing that you talked about, that you toss it and it's like a.
Yeah, it's a little plot frame.
Frame.
Yeah,
right.
that I was using was called a Daubenmeier plot frame, named for a famous Northwestern botanist. Yeah.
And so that lands on the ground, and then that's the area that you study.
Yeah, so in that particular study, I was looking at a very rare plant community in the Pacific Northwest, a grassland community in the Palouse Hills in eastern Washington and adjacent Idaho. That's just a marvelous community, although it's almost gone. 99% of it or more disappeared because it was a grassland, so it was a great place to grow grass. Well, one of the great human endeavors is the growing of grass because we eat wheat and we eat barley and all of these grasses. So it was immediately, once people realized how fertile it was transformed into one of the breadbaskets of the country. But there are these wonderful little patches of that old community remaining, which is a combination of grasses and wildflowers, and we were studying the diversity and the composition of those rare plant communities.
And in the Palouse, those are called eyebrows, right?
Yes.
Because they look like, on the hills, they look like...
Yeah, so when they first went in and broke up the prairie and started planting wheat, they plowed everything they could, but there were these steep bits at the tops of some of those hills that the plows couldn't reach, and so that's where the grasslands, the native grasslands, remain. And if you stand at a distance and peer at it, it looks like the hills have eyebrows.
One of the interesting things is that in the Oklahoma, Kansas, that sort of whole area where they're trying to get the tall grass prairie to come back and back to its native state instead of those plowed things.
Yeah, well, we realize now, looking back, that those prairie systems were fabulously diverse and interesting, with the diversity of plants and grasses that were there, and then all of the insects that went along with them, and then the mammals. And it was a really wonderful community. And there are efforts now to try to bring it back on a larger scale.
Is there something like that going on in the Palouse? Or?
Not so much in the Palouse, because first of all, less of it is there. There's just tiny patches left. And it was never well studied before it was broken up. So it would be hard to restore it in that we don't quite know what it was like.
If you left it alone to its own movement or whatever, its own desires, would it expand naturally, take over what man has planted?
Not in the same way, in that after you till and farm a piece of land, you change the soil quite a lot and introduced a lot of other plant species. So certainly you could have a grassland there again, but it would be quite different from what was there originally.
Do you eat genetically modified?
Oh, good
stuff?
question. I tend to avoid it. It's a really, it's a very fraught question now, and I'm fascinated by the fact that seeds are at the heart of it.
Yes.
I read those stories and I have to ask myself, well, why seeds, when we have genetic labs also turning out everything from glow-in-the-dark cats to featherless chickens to goats that produce spider silk. Why is it that it's seeds we feel we must rally around and defend? And I think it speaks to our deep, deep cultural connection to seeds through our history of planting and harvesting for thousands of years that makes them important to us. And so personally, I have a certain discomfort with GMOs as a biologist and as a botanist, having come up through my training and having a deep appreciation for evolution. The idea of combining genes from species that would never interact in that way in nature, I find troubling. That's not to say the technology isn't impressive and doesn't have uses that I might be comfortable with. For example, there are efforts for using that technology to improve within a species, which I'm a little more comfortable with, because you could see it's a shortcut in terms of our traditional plant breeding, but it's something you might eventually achieve through traditional means. But when you're talking about combining genes from very disparate species, as a personal issue, I find that troubling.
Your first book was about gorillas in Uganda, when you were there as a Peace Corps volunteer.
That's right.
Paul Theroux was also a Peace Corps volunteer in Uganda, but he's probably your dad's age, so
we didn't overlap.
You didn't overlap. Tell us a little about that book.
Well, basically, for a biologist and a botanist such as myself, I pretty much hit the Powerball jackpot of Peace Corps job assignments. I was assigned to work in a brand new national park called Bwindi Impenetrable Forest in the far southwestern corner of the country, right on the border with what was then Zaire, is now Democratic Republic of Congo. And the project was to work with mountain gorillas, wild families of mountain gorillas in the forest, habituating them, getting them used to people so that we could begin taking tourists in to visit them, to see them in the wild, as a way to create an economic incentive for conserving that forest and those wonderful, wonderful animals.
And did the book come out of your desire to introduce the rest of the world to that part of the world, or out of some desire to save the mountain gorillas? Do you know what I mean?
Kind of a combination. I think, again, starting with a background strong in the sciences, I came to the book and thought, well, I'm writing a book about mountain gorillas, but soon realized that the story of how the future of the gorillas is tied to the future of the people there became a very important part of what I wanted to relate. So it's really a story about mountain gorillas. There's certainly natural history in it, but it's also about people and how the fate of the gorillas is really tied to the fate of local cultures as well.
How does, this is I think maybe a big question and we probably don't have a lot of time, but how does conservation and evolution, how do those fit together for you?
What a great question.
Is it really a great?
It
I
is.
worried about that.
It's
I
insightful.
worried that it was a silly.
It's a good question, Detroit. Trust me. But it is, because oftentimes with conservation we start thinking about saving a landscape or a piece of land somewhere, a park,
or an apple,
or a species, as if we're saving art that we're going to hang on the wall someplace. But of course, evolution goes on and things change. It's what is happening around us all the time. So we come back to look at our piece of art and, Mona Lisa is, she fell asleep, or she's doing something else, or she's scratching her armpit or something. It's different. And we have to be reminded that what we're really saving in conservation work is a stage upon which evolution will play out. And so we're saving the ability for this wonderful process to happen over time, rather than saving one particular situation that is just a snapshot of evolution.
So you're working on a new book now, I understand.
Yes.
Could you tell us what that's going to be?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of projects. The next book that will be out is a children's book written for my son. He is, in addition to his fascination with seeds, he loves things to rhyme. And so we do a lot of rhyming stories, and one of those will be out in April from Sasquatch Books as an illustrated children's book. It's about a young crow named Bartholomew Quill.
Oh, very nice.
So that is a fun one. And then I'm also writing a book for adults about bees.
And you said, and this is my last question, I'm afraid we're going to be out of time, but you said when we were talking before that the book you were reading now is about honey.
Yeah.
And tell us about, because that book sounded fascinating to me.
Oh yeah, marvelous book called The Sacred Bee, an old book from the 30s by Hilary Ransom. And it's part of the research that I'm doing for a new book, which will be about the evolution of bees and the diversity of bees, not just of honeybees, but the wonderful wool carders and bumblebees and miner bees and leafcutter bees, 20,000 different species of bee in the world. So again, this wonderful biological backstory, and then this great cultural dependence upon bees for their pollination services, for the honey they provide us, for the wax. If you think about what bees meant to our ancestors, they provided two very important things. The sweetest thing in our diet, in the terms of honey, and they gave us light in the terms of the candles that were used for wax for thousands of years. So when you're talking about sweetness and light, these really important things over time to people, it makes for a wonderful cultural connection as well.
Wow, I look forward to that. And I just have to say one more thing, which is that you have now given me a reason. People always say, oh, you're just sitting there watching the grass grow. But that's what you do. And it's fabulous.
It's a full contact sport.
Yes. Thor Hanson, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nancy, for having me. What a pleasure.